Starting chapter 33 of Isaiah tonight. And just to get the historical setting or situation in regards to this chapter, there were ambassadors that were sent by Hezekiah with tribute. That's basically taxes that Assyria was putting on them. They had to pay 30 talents of gold and 300 talents of silver. So Hezekiah had sent this to Sennacherib, who at the time was at Lachish. They returned home with the news that Assyria or Sennacherib took the tribute money. Sounds good so far, right? At least from Hezekiah's standpoint. The only problem is they took the money, but they would not abandon the siege. So, send the money, it doesn't do any good. Someone turn over to 2 Kings chapter 18 and read verses 14 through verse 16, because that really sets the scene of what's taking place here. 2 Kings 18, verses 14 through 16. So basically, Hezekiah sends to Sennacherib, says, I was wrong. I've offended you. I'll pay you whatever is needed. And so Sennacherib says, okay, 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold. So Hezekiah just basically does whatever is needed in order to get the amount of money that he's needed. How much is a talent? I don't know. It's a weight of gold or a weight of silver. The reason I say I don't know, if you try and give that in today's amount, if you've ever seen the price of gold or silver, either one, it changes every day. Goes up, goes down. And so what I would tell you today would be different tomorrow. But it basically is a certain weight of gold and silver. 20 to 40 kilograms. Well, ounces, 1 kilogram, if I remember correctly, is 32.15 ounces. So around 2 pounds for each kilogram. So if you're talking about how many did you say? 20 to 40 kilograms. So multiply that by 2 and you get pounds. 40 to 80 pounds. And that's rounding it off a little bit. Because actually a kilogram is a little bit more than 2 pounds. You think of, let's see, it was at 40 to 80 pounds of gold for each one, and you have 30 of them. That's a lot of gold. 300 times the 20 to or 40 to 60 pounds of silver. 300 times that, that's a lot of silver. So today's price of gold, what is it, around 1,800, something like that, per ounce. Silver is around, I think, $24 an ounce. So that's a huge amount of money, isn't it? That's true, because where else is he going to get it, though? So he goes to the temple and basically robs the temple in order to pay this tribute money to Sennacherib. Now then, Sennacherib said, you pay this, and still doesn't stop the siege. Now then, when we come to verse 1, it might give a little bit more insight. Woe to thee that spoilest, and thou wast spoiled, and dealest treacherously, and they dealt not treacherously with thee. When thou shalt cease to spoil, thou shalt be spoiled. When thou shalt make an end to deal treacherously, they shall deal treacherously with thee. Now, I titled the first 6 verses a prayer of praise for what God will do. This is the 5th woe in this section, or in this series, that is directed against the enemies of God's people. So, it is addressed to the ones who spoiled others and that dealt treacherously with others. Now, what did we just read about what Sennacherib did? You pay me 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold to Hezekiah. Hezekiah pays him. I'm not going to change anything. I'm not going to end the siege against Jerusalem. That's dealing treacherously. So, specifically here, he's dealing with Assyrians and Sennacherib. The time is coming when they will no longer be spoiling others and dealing treacherously with others, but they're going to have the tables turned on them. At present, they are the ones spoiling others, dealing treacherously with others. But there's coming a time in which you're going to be spoiled, and which others will deal treacherously with you. Immediately after sending the tribute to Assyria by Hezekiah, Assyria then, or Sennacherib in particular, sent 3 of their chief military officers to demand surrender of Jerusalem. And we won't read 2 Kings 18:13 through 35, but if you read that basically the majority of the chapter, that's setting forth what takes place. Here Hezekiah says, I've offended you. What do I need to pay to take care of this? Here's what you have to pay. Hezekiah sends the money to him. And what does he do? He sends his chief military officers demanding Hezekiah and Jerusalem surrender. So I'm going to take your money and I'm still going to demand you surrender. Terry Hightower, in writing about this, puts it, everything was one-sided in the relations between Assyria and Judah. Assyria was doing all the talking and Judah all the giving, end quote. And that's about the situation, wasn't it? Basically, Assyria doing all the talking. You give me this, and then I'm going to demand you surrender anyway. Judah giving them the money and still having to give in surrender. So it wasn't a pretty situation for Jerusalem at the time. But this promise that God is making through Isaiah, wouldn't it feel a little comforting to Jerusalem after that happens? And here Isaiah, for God, says, while they're spoiling you and dealing treacherously with you now, tables are going to be turned, and they're going to be spoiled, and they're going to be dealt treacherously with. And can't you just see some individuals hearing that, and they just kind of smile? Like, yeah, that will be nice. So Isaiah basically is declaring a humiliating defeat of Sennacherib and his army, and thus deliverance for Jerusalem. Dale.
Basically acts about like Hitler and Mussolini, and chastises them and insults them unmercifully in a way that just unbelievably insulting. God takes care of him and the Assyrians.
Rabshakeh is the chief military officer that Sennacherib sends to, and he does speak very derisively, insultingly to Israel and about God. But we'll get to that later on in Isaiah, a couple of chapters over. Homer Haley says that Leupold, who's another commentary, suggests that the prophet may have stood on the wall of the city and flung these words of defiance into the very teeth of the ambassadors, end quote. Now, how they come across with that, I don't know, but it sure would be nice, wouldn't it? Here's these three military officers that Sennacherib have sent, main spokesman Rabshakeh, and to have Isaiah come up and say, woe to thee that spoilest. Was not spoiled. Deal treacherously. They dealt not treacherously with thee. When thou shalt cease to spoil, thou shalt be spoiled. When thou makest an end to deal treacherously, they shall deal treacherously with thee. And you know that those three ambassadors that Sennacherib sent, they would have known that Hezekiah sent the tribute money to Sennacherib. And basically they didn't care. Sennacherib, who's the king of Assyria at the time, was dealt treacherously years later because two of his sons killed him while he was worshiping in the temple of his God. If you turn over to 2 Kings chapter 19. 2 Kings 19, verses 36 and 37 says, So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed, and went and returned, and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, that Adrammelech and Sharezer, his sons, smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Armenia, and Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his stead. So here he is worshiping in the god of his or the temple of his god, and two of his sons come and basically kill him with the sword. That's true. Not much, that God wasn't much good to him, at least. You also see the same thing basically in Isaiah chapter 37 and verse 38. That came to pass as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, that Adrammelech and Sharezer, his sons, smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Armenia, and Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his stead. There's nothing to indicate this, really, but I kind of wonder if Esarhaddon had anything to do with his brothers killing their dad. As I say, there's nothing in the scriptures that indicate that. But you're right. So many times that is the case. There's some backdoor dealings, as we might put it, that end up with this taking place.
Should have taken some of that gold and silver and bribed them to do what they did. That's not where it came from.
Well, we don't. I would even wonder how much of the gold and silver that they had plundered, not only from Jerusalem but other nations, how much of that was really left at the time. And kind of we'll mention this later on, but when 185,000 of his soldiers die in one night, his army is devastated. As they return home, they're having to return home through all of these nations that they've plundered. What do you think is going to happen to them? Well, what does it say? When thou shalt cease to spoil. Well, they've ceased to spoil now. What's going to happen? Thou shalt be spoiled. So others are now spoiling them.
They probably had messengers went throughout the area saying, hey, we got information that'll help you recoup some of your losses.
I doubt that they needed any messengers. I imagine the word spread like wildfire. The lines of communication, they go fairly quickly. And you don't even need the internet or television to get those things spread, do you? So, when there was not even what? A battle. Yeah. They're just, they wake up and here's 185,000 of them dead.
Makes you wonder what kind of grapevine talk would have occurred related to that.
Well, I'm sure there is a lot of it. But now then, as they limp home, these nations, they had no love for Sennacherib and the Assyrians. And so anything that they could get off of them, they were going to. That's why I think also that what we just read in relationship to Sennacherib's death. Why? Because the power of Assyria was gone. They had lost everything. And so his sons, they probably had ideas of grandeur themselves. That's gone.
Those surrounding nations were mad at 15 wet hens, and they were already discussing as they were approaching, we're going to pay them back. We'll make an agreement, even though we're normally enemies, and we're going to pay these governments back for what they did to us.
I think that's what we've been saying. So they are going to be spoiled themselves because of all of the evil that they've been involved in. In verse 2 then, he says, O Lord, be gracious unto us. We have waited for thee. Be thou their arm every morning, our salvation also in the time of trouble. Isaiah is here speaking for the people. Probably those who are faithful. And he's interceding on their behalf, petitioning Yahweh, or a prayer to him, O Lord, O Yahweh, be gracious to us. And to deliver them during this time of distress and danger. Prayers to God. Of course, we know that the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. Well, here, they are in distress. They are in danger. Hezekiah, realizing the dire situation that they're in, sends the tribute money, and Sennacherib, instead of withdrawing from Jerusalem, sends his three ambassadors and demands their surrender. That's a time of distress. Now then, and we'll see this later on in the book as well, what Sennacherib and the Assyrians would do. Conquer a land or a city. Now then, how are we going to exercise control over that city? We're going to leave and just expect them to bow down and give us whatever we want? Well, that's not going to work, because they'd just have to come back and keep repeating the same problem.
They would scare them after death by dealing cruelly with them, excessively cruelly.
No, that's not how they dealt with it. What they did is they would take the people from this city and transport them to another city. Transport those people, and so you have a continual movement of the people, and by that, people who are now living in this new city, they have no real loyalty to that city. They don't care about it. they've been transported there against their will. They probably hate those people who are living there. So that's the way in which they exercise control, even though they didn't have to really come back and deal with them all the time.
They do that, the same thing in World War II, is that what he's saying? They do the same thing?
He was saying that the Russians did that with the Baltic areas, Baltic lands. They would move people out and move others in. And those in the Baltic lands hated the Russians and those people who were there at that point in time.
What would you describe that as? Like psychological terror by doing that? Dirty like cold water or something to that effect?
Well, you can research that from a psychological standpoint and tell us next week. I don't know. I know the effects that it has. There is a hatred, despising the people who are there now, who have been moved in. Tear down that wall of hatred between, when you went to Latvia, the Latvians and the Russians. And that is, to a great extent, the exact same thing you see in the early church between the Jews and the Gentiles. There was a hatred that was there between them. And when they took the gospel to the Gentiles, you think that hatred was just immediately overcome? No. Just like they were, yes. That was to the Romans that you were grafted in, that's true. But you can also be cut off, and they can be grafted back in. But I was also thinking of, you remember the contribution that Paul was collecting for the saints in Jerusalem, primarily. They did it for the nation as well, we see. But it was to break down that barrier between the Jews and the Gentiles. If the Gentiles are sending all of that money and financial support to Jerusalem, their Jewish brethren, and those who are sending it are Gentiles, Paul was building a bridge between the two to break down that hatred and those barriers that had been there for 1,500 years. But again, there's the barriers that are there. The people hated each other. So to Jerusalem, this was a time of great distress, because what's going to happen if Sennacherib overtakes Jerusalem? Same thing he's done in so many other places. He's going to ship people in and ship us out. So what's the result? Pray to God. We face all sorts and types of distress, and yes, sometimes danger in our lives. Our response should always be to think of God and to pray to Him. Now then, if these people in Jerusalem are going to be saved, Well, it wasn't by their military might. They didn't have much at the time. It wasn't going to be by outlasting the Assyrians. They couldn't do it. It was only going to be by the power of God and God's graciousness to them. And so, God, be gracious unto us. And he mentions, we have waited for thee. The idea of waited isn't simply just sitting back and waiting, our idea of wait. To a great extent, the idea of waiting for thee is we placed our trust in you. God, we placed our trust in thee to take care of this situation. We realize we can't save ourselves. We've got to rely on you, and so we're waiting on you. We're trusting in you. Someone read Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 17. Okay. There's the same expression, I will wait upon the Lord. Now, he hid his face from Jacob, or the house of Jacob, but I'm going to look for him. I'm going to wait on him. I'm going to place my trust in him. Turn over to the 25th chapter, and someone read verse 9. So again, the idea we've waited for him. But notice in that he will save us. You can see the trust that they have upon God. He will save us. It's not as if, well, we hope that we'll save you or that you will save us. But there is a confidence that is there. We know that God will save. We've waited for him. We will be glad and rejoice in his salvation. You see the same thing in chapter 26 and verse 8. That yea, in the way of thy judgments, O Lord, have we waited for thee. The desire of our soul is to thy name and to the remembrance of thee. So all through the book, we've waited for God. We've put our trust in him. He's the one who's going to save us. So it shows their dependence upon God, their need for support and strength. We see that in the next phrase, be thou their arm every morning. The arm would be that symbol of power or strength. So he's calling upon God. We need your support, your strength continually, every morning. It's not something that, well, we'll trust in God now and wait for him, but then after he delivers us, we're going to forget about it. Have you ever seen someone who goes through some traumatic experience in their life, and as a result they turn to God, but then after a short period they go back to the same lifestyle they were doing before? Yeah. There's probably a lot of stories about that, like that, but we probably all know individuals who we could describe that way. They go through something in their life. They're going to turn to God. They're going to do what God wants. They're going to be obedient to Him. Many times they will repent of their sins and all of this, or even obey the gospel, being baptized. And then after a few months, they're right back to what they were doing before and living the type of life they were living before.
We don't know how many times every day that God through His providence.
That's a good point. We don't know what all God does for us behind the scenes. How many times has God protected us, spared our lives? We don't know. We don't know what could have taken place.
Look what He did to Mordecai and Esther.
Well, there's a good illustration of God doing that. Mordecai and Esther, throughout the book of Esther. And in that, what is it, chapter 4 and about verse 14, who knows whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? We center upon that a lot of times. But there's another idea that he expresses to Esther, and that is God will deliver us. Whether He does it through you or not, God will deliver us. But if you don't go into the king and make this request and he doesn't, God's still going to deliver us, but we might be dead. And of course, we know the story of Esther going into the king and finally the deliverance of the Israelites as a result of her actions. But whether she went into the king or not, God was going to deliver them. And that's what Mordecai says. Now then, his additional words basically, we might be dead because we didn't act, but God's still going to spare the Israelites. He'll find a way. God working behind the scenes. And if you want a story, a lesson on providence, I mean, there's where it is. It's the providence of God that here's this drunken feast. Wait a minute. God using a drunken feast? Yes, God used a drunken feast because what did happen? Ahasuerus, wasn't it? Or was that Arxes? I've forgotten. He makes this request, not a request, but a demand of the queen, Vashti. Come show yourself off to these drunken men. And so what happens? She says, no. Wait a minute, you can't do that to the king. Take her out. Remove her from being queen. Oh, but now then the king might get a little lonesome, so we need to find a queen. That's God's working. All of that was God's working behind the scenes long before Esther is told you need to go in and to the king. And it was long before Haman made his decision, I want to kill all of the Jews. God had already set in motion what was necessary to save them before they even were facing danger. Now then, what does God do for us? I don't know. But I know that He's working behind the scenes and for our good. I may not understand it. I may not know what it is. But I can have confidence that God is doing those things. Now, that's the same thing we're seeing here. Be thou their arm every morning. They are recognizing their need, for support, for strength, in a continual way. So, the waiting for God is to be patient and to allow Him to act in His own time and His own way. They might not understand it. I'm sure they didn't. Especially, can you imagine when here's Rabshakeh out here insulting Hezekiah, insulting God, and telling the people, you're going to be having to eat your own waste. Need to surrender. And here's basically Isaiah saying, don't worry about it, just let God handle it. He'll be your strength. He'll be your support. Let Him act in His own way. And when Sennacherib comes and encircles the city and going to destroy it, God acts. And He saves them. And thus it is really a plea here. Our salvation in the time of trouble, it is a plea for God's graciousness in saving them. In Isaiah 30 and verse 19, it was stated, for the people shall dwell in Zion at Jerusalem. Thou shalt weep no more. He will be very gracious unto thee at the voice of thy cry. When he shall hear it, he will answer thee. God will save them. What a wonderful idea that He is the only one who could save them, and He does. Because of their, as Isaiah 30 and verse 19, at the voice of their cry. And here's Isaiah for the people. Lord, be gracious to us. Save us in time of trouble. We can have that same desire. We can express those same ideas today. When we are faced with problems and difficulties that seem to just overbearing to us, we plead to God, save us. You're our strength. You're our help. And we rely totally upon Him. Next week, Lord willing, we will start in verse 3 then.